Hello from Gallaudet. We're here in Washington, D.C., and I'm really excited to be able to present on the topic of early intervention and how it can make a difference. Of course, we'll base this information on research as well as trends. So, welcome! Before I begin, let me tell you a little bit about myself. My name is Beth Benedict, and I have many different roles. But first and foremost, I will be speaking as a mother. I am the mother of 2 deaf children, and I experienced going through the early intervention program as a mother. That process gave me a sense of what is happening across the nation. Early intervention is truly important. I'll be explaining it based on my experiences and from things I have seen. As you can see, I work at Gallaudet University, and I work in the Communication Studies department. I am also the president of the American Society for Deaf Children, ASDC. The link is here if you need more information. I'll be mentioning that organization periodically throughout this presentation. You can see displayed here the topics we will cover. We'll look at the research, the trends, and discuss how you can make a difference in this area. Early intervention has become the new hot topic today, and maybe you wonder why. I'll be explaining why it is such a hot topic and questioning whether the information that families receive is ideal. I'm sure you face many questions as you work with young infants, and I hope this information will help you better understand your role and how you can handle various scenarios. Now take a look here. For this, well, I'd like you to think about a parent's first encounter with a deaf person. What is that experience, and for what % of hearing parents? I should ask you, who is the first deaf person they meet? Typically, the deaf person they meet for the first time is their own deaf infant. That is true for 95% of the parents. The deaf person they first meet is their own baby. The other 5% of hearing parents may have met a deaf person before because they have a deaf relative or neighbor or know someone at work. But for 95%, the first deaf person they meet is their own baby. Remember that deafness is an invisible disability. So often people may pass by a deaf person without realizing that the person is deaf. So I'd like you to try to put yourself in the parent's shoes. Parents can't imagine what a deaf person can do. They have no clue at all. Maybe some parents wonder if deaf people have a short life expectancy. They may not know if deaf people are employed, or if they're able to live independently. This was the case for my mom. Though she herself is deaf, her parents were hearing. My mom met a deaf person for the first time when she was 12 years old. Before that, she thought she would die young, or that she would become hearing when she got older, because she had never met another deaf person. She had no role models. Of course, her parents had no concept of what a deaf person could do. Let's now focus on early intervention research. We all have the common mindset that hearing parents have no clue about deaf babies. Let's look at what the research says. That will help us imagine what a good model or a good program would look like. Here's the research. This research describes 2 early intervention programs in different locations. One is in Utah, and the other is in Tennessee. They do the same number of home visits, and they have the same number of times that parents attend the program for playgroup and support group sessions. They are similar in every way except one. The program in Utah has a deaf mentor. That means a deaf mentor comes alongside and works with the families. The mentor goes to the home and shows the family how to communicate with the deaf baby. The mentor signs to the baby. They might even all go out to McDonald's, and the parents watch how a deaf person orders food. They see that a deaf person does not always have to be escorted by an interpreter. They learn all kinds of things, even how a deaf person wakes up in the morning. Maybe you think this is silly, but when my own children were born, I was involved in 3 different early intervention programs. The reason I attended all 3 of them is because I wanted to see what the system looked like. One of those 3 programs was county-based. One was center-based at a residential school for deaf children. The other was a day program. To be honest, before I started attending these programs myself, I thought the early intervention system was great. We deaf people have been around for a long time, so I didn't think there were really any issues. However, once I engaged with the system, I realized that each of these 3 types of programs was different in terms of the needs they met and the services they offered. I was a bit taken aback at this realization. I also recognized that I was deaf, so I already had awareness. It is important to keep in mind, however, that across the nation, 95% of deaf children are born to families who are hearing and who are not familiar with all of the kinds of services they may need but may not be receiving. There is a great deal of variation in these programs, and we have a responsibility. Anyway, because I was in the programs, I decided to make friends with some of the hearing parents. In the back of my mind, I knew that mentoring was essential. We would talk, and we would become friends. Later on, I did ask them about the grief process that hearing parents go through when their infant is identified as being deaf. I completely understand why the grief occurs, because it is an unexpected event, and it is natural. All parents have to go through that grief, that's a given. But my question was, how long should the grieving process persist as the child grows? So I asked the parents, what was their number one fear? The response was that they were not sure their deaf daughter would be able to keep a job for very long. That struck me as an unusual concern, so I inquired further and learned that they were concerned about how she would wake up because their daughter would not hear the music that came on when the alarm clock went off. They didn't realize that there are alarm clocks with vibration devices or flashing lights. They simply didn't know. Once they met a deaf person and learned what was available, their worries were assuaged. They knew their daughter would be able to keep a job. Having a deaf person in the program addresses those little things. Research comparing the Utah and the Tennessee programs found that families in the Utah program had more confidence, had a shorter grieving period, and used sign language as well as speaking for communication. Their deaf children demonstrated higher self-concept and self-confidence, had better language acquisition, and were higher in many other aspects of development as compared to their peers in Tennessee. The one thing that made the difference was the deaf mentoring program. That was key. That was done in collaboration. It's the same idea as the previous example. Research was done on programs in Washington State, where it was found that children who had deaf mentoring programs and opportunity for socialization had better self-esteem, social, emotional, and thinking skills, and communication development. Their gains were significant compared to other programs. Those skills remained stagnant in programs that did not have deaf mentors. Hintermeyer, a researcher from Germany, conducted research on 2 distinct groups. One group of families had met deaf adults right away following the birth of their infant. The other group did not meet deaf adults until much later. The study found that the grieving process for the first group was much shorter, and parents were soon ready to move on. The families were more optimistic as compared to the other group of families where grieving persisted. Another example of research was done by Moeller, and it's quite fascinating. I'm sure you have already met some families where the diagnosis of deafness comes very late. The families are upset that they didn't know the child was deaf, and they feel as if they've been speaking to the child for nothing all of this time. Moeller's research was a good study in that it compared 4 groups of families. The first group had babies identified very early through infant hearing screening, and they were also families who were heavily involved in the early intervention program. The second group also had an early identification and entered programs early, but families were not involved in early intervention programs. The third group had babies identified late, and they came into the early intervention programs late, but the families were very involved. The fourth group had identification late and entered programs late, and families were not involved in the programs. So which group of kids did well? Which ones picked up language? Yes, it was the first group, those who had early identification and early intervention family involvement. Now, which was the second best group? It was those with children identified late, but the families were involved. They did better than those who were identified early, but the families were not involved. That group ranked third, and fourth was the last group of late identified uninvolved families. That gives us hope, because if the baby is identified late and comes into programs late, it doesn't mean that you lose hope and give up. The situation is not hopeless because family involvement plays a big part in the process. I want to emphasize how important family involvement is. I know that families often dwell on which communication choice is best, on whether to sign or use oral methods, but communication is not the only thing. Yes, communication is important, but it's not the only thing. Another important factor is family involvement. So we need to remind families that this is critical. Like I mentioned previously, I went through 3 early intervention programs, but not one of them actually told me that family involvement was important. I remember talking about communication and reading about how important it is, but I always had the sense that there was more to it than that. So I decided to go to the school and watch what the school was doing with my child, and then reinforce that at home. So as I went along in this process, I ended up entering the PhD program for early communication, and that's where I finally learned that this was called family involvement, and I don't understand why no one told me that. It needs to be emphasized. Some families leave everything to the school. I know you, as teachers, have frustrations when they leave everything up to you, but it is up to us to remind those families that family involvement is crucial. Now, another factor is high expectations. This is also important. Bodner-Johnson conducted interviews of 125 different families looking for common themes. She noticed factors such as communication, but also identified high expectations as a theme. It's important for us to look at the child's capabilities and focus on what the child can do. You must have a can-do attitude. The child senses that the parents have high expectations because children are not dumb. They can read your moods and thoughts, sorry to say. There is more research on early intervention, but because of time, I have selected the most important to describe here. Now let's move to visual language research. I want to be very explicit about something. It is obvious that I support ASL communication. That's quite evident because I sign. However, I do want to make it clear that I am a strong advocate of ASL as our language of communication, and I also place high value on reading and writing English. I value English because we live in America, and we must know English to survive. So English is very important to me. I value ASL and English. And for those of you who wish to use spoken language, I have no problem with those families who opt for spoken English and the use of a cochlear implant. That is fine. The only issue I have, is when children are forbidden to sign. Sign is a natural language, and you can't really deny it to the child. If you want to also speak, then sure, have the best of both worlds. If you can, why not? But I do have a problem with forbidding sign language. Based on my experience and on research, I'll explain to you why. In visual language research, there were studies done of deaf children in deaf families. You will see here a number of different studies, and all of them reached the same result. They all found that deaf children of deaf parents performed better than deaf children of hearing parents. This was a routine finding in research done through the 1970s, and in 2000 this research resumed. You may wonder why the research was stopped and then brought back. And this was because the findings were always the same. There were no new results in comparison of these two groups. Now, I want to make myself clear. I do not actually agree with labeling the two distinct groups as deaf parents and hearing parents. There are parents who sign, and there are parents who do not. We have many hearing parents who use sign language, and their children do fine. Sometimes even better than those who have deaf parents. I remember growing up in school myself. I had friends whose parents were hearing, and they did just fine. So there are hearing parents who are fluent signers too. It's the same with my kids in school. They are in classes with deaf children who have hearing parents who sign well. I often tell parents, in the ideal situation, hearing parents who sign fluently can even interpret the radio news broadcast to their children while they are in the car. Not only can the parents sign, but they can also provide language access to their children for all of the auditory information that they hear. They can interpret it or even explain to their children what is happening on the news. As a deaf parent, I can't do that. So really, the hearing, signing parent is often in a better position than we are. We often focus just on the deaf parents, thinking that's a guarantee because the parents are skilled signers. It's not always true, so keep that in mind. Now, this research is interesting. This study found that there is a critical age. Well, let me back up for a minute and explain that the researcher holds an AUD, which is the equivalent of a PhD in audiology. She found that the age for acquisition of language is more important than speech. Speech skills can be acquired later on, but language must begin from day one. Neurons in the brain are still alive, and stimulation of those neurons is important for language acquisition. Those neurons will decay, in a way, by the age of 3. But learning speech continues. So it is important to have language skills first, and then speech can certainly be added. Another good body of research, which has been very hot since 2012, is by Humphreys. It has been published in many well-known, peer-reviewed journals. After thorough analysis, these studies show that the use of sign language does not harm a child's development in any way. It does not hurt speech development. It doesn't hurt anything. There is no evidence that the use of sign language has any negative developmental impact at all. In fact, the studies show that signing actually supports speech development. It helps with language development. It helps with self-esteem. It helps with self-concept. Signing does not harm. It does no harm at all. Another research study, and this is quite fascinating, was done by Richmond, Rakowski, and Hickson. What's interesting about this research is that the three researchers have no affiliation with deaf people or deaf children. They were completely unaware, I'd even say clueless, when it comes to deaf people. They did research on the general population, on hearing people, and found that hearing people use their eyes, they depend on their eyes to get 80% of the information. It's not through their ears, but through their eyes. Their research showed the importance of eyes for cultural information, for communication, and also for accessing how gestures are used in language. It is so odd, then, that we have not encouraged this with deaf babies. It seems odd that visual information is so encouraged for hearing people, but not for deaf babies. For deaf babies, we are told that the eyes are not important, but the focus must be on the ears instead. Something seems wrong with that picture. So use your ears, sure, but use your eyes too. And what you hear is an added bonus. Okay, now the next research discusses why signing is important for children who use cochlear implants. Frequently, hospitals who evaluate children for cochlear implants to see if the child qualifies to receive an implant will say to the parents that they must stop signing. Not all do this, some don't, but some do. They tell the family to stop signing, and that if signing is used, the cochlear implant will not work. I've heard that. I am president of the American Society for Deaf Children. We have 4,000 families in our database, and I hear these stories everywhere I go. I hear these stories almost every day. The families tell me that their audiologist or their cochlear implant doctor told them not to sign. As a teacher here at Gallaudet, I have many students in the undergraduate program who have come through my classes. Of course, we often discuss the topic of early intervention. It is common for students to say, "My mom was told not to sign by the doctor and the audiologist, and so I struggled all of my life, but now, finally, I'm signing." We can't blame parents for following the doctor's advice. Often we think the audiologist and the doctors must be right and must have all of the answers. But at the same time, we must be open-minded, and we owe it to families to provide them with all of the information and allow families to make decisions, and let them know that they do not have to make just one decision. If they want to have a cochlear implant and sign, why not? It seems that most believe you must have a cochlear implant and never sign, or only allow signing much later. However, research shows that children with cochlear implants and signing do better than children with cochlear implants alone. Let me show you some more research. This is interesting research. It was conducted in Tehran, Iran. 2 groups of 7 children each were studied. And the children were matched in terms of characteristics such as the age they received the cochlear implant, the age they began signing or began speech training, and so on. The only difference between the groups was that one group had deaf parents and the other group had hearing parents. The group with hearing parents did not sign, and the group with deaf parents did sign. After 4 years, do you know which group of children had the best speech? It was the group who had deaf parents. Those children spoke better than the children whose parents did not sign. This clearly showed that signing is helpful for speech development. It's because you need language. You need to first have the concepts. If you have no language, then you have no concepts, so what do you speak? If you have language, then you have concepts to talk about. It's about what is needed first, one before the other. Here is additional research showing the same. People often think that the cochlear implant is somehow language. It is not. The cochlear implant helps with speech development. The cochlear implant is a communication tool, whereas ASL is a language. ASL, or whatever sign language is used in your particular country, is a language. Deaf children are already wired to learn through their eyes. When they are born, and it is a given that when they can't hear, their eyes become more important than their ears. Therefore, maximize the vision and then add sound later with a cochlear implant. Here again is a study conducted by audiologists. Keep in mind that when a child is given a cochlear implant, it doesn't mean that they suddenly understand everything. They still miss the opportunity for incidental learning. Suppose I am 2 or 3 years old, and my parents are in the kitchen. I can't hear that far away, even though I have a cochlear implant. I haven't learned how to yet. When my parents are talking in the kitchen, I miss the opportunity to learn what they are talking about, even though they are not talking directly to me. A deaf baby who has parents who can sign can look up and see what the parents are talking about. Maybe they are making plans for the evening, such as going to a movie after dinner. The child becomes aware of the information instead of being unaware, and then suddenly experiencing the family going off somewhere unexpectedly. It's not only a situation like that, there are many opportunities like that, and we need to keep that in mind. Deaf babies are, of course, visual learners, right? You can see in the picture how they visually engage with each other and with the toys. And these babies are all hearing. Here's a summary of what is actually needed based on all of the research. Full language access, a supportive learning environment, family involvement, high expectations, language models, role models, and a can-do attitude, which relates to high expectations. And this list makes for a nice model. Maybe your programs can review this and it can become your checklist. You can determine if your program has these characteristics or not. I think this list is ideal. And honestly, I think this is how my kids were raised. My kids are now 23 and 24, and they are doing great. Okay, now I would like to address common misinformation. Let me show you the list. This is a list of common misinformation that parents receive, and each of these has to be clarified for parents. They are not true. Now, I'm not going to lie. Previously, the deaf community was opposed to cochlear implants, but now the deaf community is accepting. I think the reason for the previous opposition was because in the past, all of the cochlear implant centers forbid the use of sign language. More than likely, it was the banning of sign language that made the deaf community so resistant to cochlear implants, but now they are accepted. Another example is if deaf children sign, they will not talk. That's not true. I have many friends who can sign and speak. Another myth is that you have to choose between signing and speaking. Who said that? I haven't seen anything that tells me that I must choose one, but for some reason, that is the mindset, and it seems to have been passed down over the years. These are all statements that parents need to know are not true. Clearly, this information is important. We can't wait. We have to start now with signing, speaking, role models. We need to give children everything, all of the information, and not hold anything back. As you can see here, I have put in writing English. English is very important. With my own children, I started reading books to them when they were about 3 months of age. I knew that they didn't understand, but I wanted my kids to see reading books as a part of our daily routine. I mean, we eat something every day, we go to the bathroom every day, we read books every day. It's part of our life experience. We have to do it. I hope you see how much I value the importance of reading and writing English. It is very important to me. Now, let's envision what a program should look like. In doing so, we can look back at the issues, the trends, and the laws. I've listed here UNHS, NHS, and EDI, and I'd like for you to take note of these. One of the reasons early intervention has become such a hot topic today is because of the hearing screening laws, which were passed in 1991 in most states. If you're wondering about your own state, some states call this NHS, some states call it EHDI or EDI, and some states call it UNHS. Regardless of the name, all three mean the same thing. So you can see from this listing, in 1993, only 3% of deaf babies were identified as deaf at birth. That 3% were typically those who had deaf parents. The others were found to be deaf later on, and the average age of identification was 2.5 years of age. That means all that time was a missed opportunity for language learning. So, in 1991, in most states, and then others followed, they put this law in place. It's interesting, now 42 states and the District of Columbia have a newborn hearing screening law. So that means there are states that do not have the law. But even though they don't have the law, they do still have a policy under their healthcare system. You know, when a baby is born, all babies must have a PKU test done. That's done with a heel prick and it measures their growth process. That PKU testing is not a law, but it is a healthcare policy. So those 8 states felt that hearing screening was a similar concept and put it in the same category as the PKU. So, in actuality, all states and DC require newborn hearing screening. Now, as you can see, many, 85.99%, of deaf babies are identified in the hospital before they go home. You might wonder why it is not 100%. Well, some parents desire home delivery, and some use a midwife. So there are some who are missed, and that is why it is not 100%. But we still encourage movement in that direction. So now the age of diagnosis has shifted to 3 to 6 months of age. It's much better. Now, for hearing screening levels. Keep in mind that many people might think that once the baby is identified as deaf, that diagnosis stands. Here you see that of 1,000 identified initially, 4 are determined to be deaf. On further analysis, what this actually means is that 1 in 1,000 has a hearing level of 50 decibels or above, 2.5 have a hearing level between 30 dB and 50 dB. You may notice that I use the word level instead of hearing loss. I have a problem with the term hearing loss because many of the children identified are born without hearing to begin with. They did not lose their hearing. It is simply their hearing level. Our selection of words is important. There are many examples of words we choose, like loss, that cause parents to feel depressed. The word hearing levels allows parents to focus on action. Keep in mind that the newborn screening equipment can only detect hearing levels of 50 dB or greater, not below that. They are working on trying to get that down to a 30 dB level. When a baby is identified in the hospital, the family is referred to an audiologist who can more specifically determine the hearing level. Now, we have to keep in mind that if the child is identified with a 30 or 40 or 50 dB hearing level, you can assume that the child will speak. That child has a lot of hearing, so certainly make use of it. Be careful not to make the hasty assumption that sign language must be used as the only option. You will see here a listing of different resources. These are important resources related to hearing screening, early intervention programs, and so on. You see here EDI, Early Hearing Detection and Intervention, which is obviously very important. We do have an EDI center that is government funded under the CDC, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. The CDC receives a budget from the government, and then they distribute those funds among various entities such as EDI. In that sense, EDI is under the CDC, which is somewhat unfortunate. It's sad that we were under an organization with the word disease in the title, because what message does that send to families? Are we as deaf people diseased? Are we contagious? That's what makes it unfortunate. So you also see the AAP, the American Academy of Pediatrics. That is another important organization to work with because the AAP has about 42,000 doctors all across the U.S. And, of course, we can't expect pediatricians to have expertise with deaf babies. They don't typically work with deaf babies. I did, however, ask about medical school training and how many courses they have where they learn about deaf people. I was thinking, like many people do, when I asked that question, that they might have at least a course or two, but they don't even have one course. They have about 15 to 30 minutes on the topic, and in that 15 to 30 minutes, they discuss how sound waves work, and that's all. So, of course, the doctor's mentality is, when encountering a deaf baby, to think back to what they learned in graduate school about sound waves and determine that a cochlear implant is the only solution. So we need to work with them. Next is ASHA. This is another important organization to work with. As you know, there are audiological training programs all across the nation. In the U.S., we have about 200 of these programs. Of those 200 programs, how many do you think require students to learn about deaf culture and history and ASL? Only maybe 2 or 3 of them. And for only one is it a strength. In that program, they require students to know about deaf history and culture and to learn ASL. That program is right here at Gallaudet University. The rest probably do have ASL classes or deaf culture classes offered as elective courses, and that's all. For example, I just learned about one program in California, and in that program, audiology students are required to take ASL classes, which is good. However, in that program, they had about 19 classes, including ASL 1, 2, and 3. Different levels and sections of the course in 2009. However, due to budget cuts, there is only one ASL class remaining. Again, it has to do with how the community views ASL, and it is not as accessible now as it was in the past in the audiology and speech fields. So we have to encourage change, and I've been working with ASHA to try to change their criteria for certification. Audiologists must be certified by ASHA. It's a lot of work and a long process. So I need you in the audiology field to work on that project. Let me know. I'm asking for your help as I can't do everything myself. Another one on the list is NCHAM. It's a center based in Utah. And maybe you've heard of a man by the name of Dr. Carl White. He runs that center. He keeps track of the numbers of deaf babies born and other statistics. That website, www.infanthearing.org, is really a one-stop site to go to. You can click on the link for your state and find out how many babies were born in that state in that year and how many of those babies were identified as deaf. You can also find out what the laws say in that state. And you can find out what materials families receive when their child is identified as deaf at the hospital. You will be surprised at how limited that information is. You really will be surprised. So I suggest that you go to that site and then get more involved in changing those brochures. Another thing you can do, using Maryland as an example, is that you can find out what the laws say in Maryland. And you will see that the law talks about hearing screening and about an advisory council as well. You will see who has to be on it and what an advisory council does. I'll show you that next. I think it is good for you to go through these links and find out more about what your state has to offer. And I also suggest you make some changes. You can see on this slide a list of words. The first column is from the medical perspective, and that can be compared with words listed from the socio-cultural perspective on the other side of the slide. One example is the contrast between communication options and communication opportunities. It's like I said, do you have to pick just one? When you say communication options or choices, it sounds like it. If you use the word opportunities, I think parents are motivated to include many instead of just one. The same is true for loss as opposed to levels. And the word intervention sounds like interference as opposed to involvement. The word intervention seems related to treatment for drugs. That's a typical setting to hear the word intervention. Do you think deaf people fit into that category? Involvement is better. That's why the sign I use for intervention is the sign to mean involvement. Also, failed the hearing test can be noted as referred with explanation. Typically, when a deaf infant has a hearing screening in the hospital, the parents receive a form that states the baby failed the hearing test. Well, of course the parents grieve. Why not change that to referral with explanation? Then the parents can go for the hearing test and get more information. The same is true for diagnosed as opposed to identified, and changing the phrase grieving process to journey. If you look at the materials that parents in your state receive, all of the terms from the medical perspective are present, whereas none of the terms from the sociocultural perspective are represented. I've often discussed what would be the result if parents received information that was written from a sociocultural perspective. It might leave them with a positive feeling and give them the sense that it's not so bad being deaf after all. They'd feel good. Here you see the Maryland Advisory Council. This is a good example of what Maryland law says. Maryland law gives a list of who should be on the Advisory Council, including a deaf role model, a representative from the Maryland Association of the Deaf, an organization for deaf members, a representative from the Maryland School for the Deaf, a member from the Alexander Graham Bell Association, and so on. If you read through the list, you will see that it is obviously well balanced. Sadly, it is the only one out of 50 states to have this. It's important for you to contact your state EDI coordinator and find out who is on the advisory committee. Again, go to that website, www.infanthearing.org, and click on the state coordinator. You will see the names and email addresses for you to make contact with the EDI coordinators. You also see on the list, marked with an asterisk, an article about the Maryland Academy of Audiologists. There is a large national-level organization, the American Academy of Audiologists, the AAA. And every state has a chapter. For Maryland, that is the MAA. Through the advisory committee, the audiologists realized that they had a lot to learn about the deaf community, deaf services, and deaf resources. So they asked a representative from the Maryland Association of the Deaf to put information in their MAA newsletter from time to time. I think that is a good way to collaborate with each other and work together in educating each other. It's important to remember who it is that either suffers or benefits from the whole system, and that is our kids. We really have no choice but to work together to make things better for our families and their children. Another important document and website is shown here, www.jcih.org. It was established in 1970 and it has 2 or 3 different representatives from 7 different organizations, as you can see. That group comes together twice annually to write position papers on hearing screenings and other topics. I'm on that committee. I represent the CED, the Council on Education of the Deaf. I know on that list there's only one signing-friendly organization, the CED. The others listed are not. You may wonder how I manage working with that organization. We agreed that we must accept position papers and other processes all by means of group consensus, which makes it okay. Take a look at that website and at our position papers on infant screening, and we just wrote another one on early intervention services. The next few slides will summarize that paper for you. The JCIH papers are very important in the field of audiology. If you ask any audiologist if they are familiar with the JCIH papers, they will say yes. It's like their textbook, like their Bible, so to speak. There are a lot of good things about encouraging signing and speech development and about involving deaf role models. That's in there right now. But often the deaf community is unaware that we do have those things here to support us. Here is a summary of what the JCIH paper covers. Basically, it says we must have screening and so on. And here too, notice knowledgeable professionals in the area of child development, communication, and so on. It says knowledgeable. You will also notice that it says communication options. I did try to argue for the phrase communication opportunities, but they were not ready to accept it. We've gone back and forth a little bit, but that's fine. This focuses on the JCIH paper on hearing screening. That was published in 2007. The one we just published in 2012 focuses on early intervention services. You can see a list of mandates here, and you can see that we inserted services for ASL and that individuals must be fluent in ASL as well. Here, other languages are also included. It's not only ASL, but if the family speaks Spanish, early intervention services must include that as well, and be experts in the area of additional disabilities. We now have autism on the rise, and many deafblind babies too. Another mandate is that it is important for families to meet other families too. This is guidance from deaf and hard of hearing adults. It's in the JCIH paper. We ask that you provide support to the JCIH paper, which was approved by 7 well-known organizations. So that says a lot. We also just added an audiological and visual checklist. It's a parallel track, so it could, in a sense, be the start of a curriculum. So, we have position papers that say what must be included, and we have research that clearly states that the deaf community must be included. If you wonder why it is so important, it demonstrates that deaf people are fine and that we can live independently, which gives families a sense of confidence about many things. You know, often we are asked about jobs. How many deaf lawyers do we have in the US? Take a guess. Now it's more than 200, and that number is growing rapidly. How many hearing parents know that? We have deaf teachers. We have deaf doctors, deaf veterinarians, deaf business owners. We even have some deaf people who work as janitors or as chefs. All of the same types of jobs that hearing people have. Hearing people work as janitors too. Members of the deaf community are no different. We need to show that we are the same. So, now, how can you make a difference? I have a long list, and lucky for you, I will not grade you on it, but I have just listed these here to give you an idea of what you can do. Get involved in those organizations that I just mentioned. I've already explained about the first 3. Of the last 3, the first is ASDC. ASDC is a volunteer-based organization run by parents and professionals in the field. They believe in using signing as well as whatever else the family wants. Another one is Hands and Voices. It is now very much alive and has chapters in almost every state. The abbreviation for Hands and Voices is HV. Hands and Voices beliefs include not telling a family which communication opportunities a family should select. Their focus is on emotional support. I personally have mixed feelings. Hands and Voices has a board with representatives from every state. but almost none of them have a deaf person as a representative. So I'm encouraging deaf people to get involved with Hands and Voices. Deaf people often struggle because the organization doesn't take a stand for sign language, and I can understand that. But there are people on the board who support speech, so deaf people should also come on the board in order to have a balance. In some states, Hands and Voices is great. In other states, they need more people involved. So check your state to see what is happening. Thirdly is AGB. Obviously, that is an organization grounded in the oral educational approach. So really, families have 3 choices, or multiple choices in various combinations. But regardless, the bottom line is that parents need to know about them all. We should not be holding back on information. Some parents don't learn about ASDC until much later, or some families never hear about Hands and Voices, or some don't know about AGB. So it is our responsibility to provide all of the information. That's how families get support. I think I have explained all of these. The shared reading program is from the Clare Center, and it is a wonderful program. Go to the Clare website to learn more about that. Another is Gallaudet's Infant, Toddler, and Family Certification Program. I am one of the co-coordinators along with another individual, Dr. Marilyn Sassler. We've been running that program for the past 4 years, and it's a good opportunity for those in the field who have already obtained their master's degrees in fields such as audiology, social work, counseling, education, or what have you, but who still want to know more about early intervention, want to know what is appropriate, and want some tips but don't want another master's degree. They can go into that program. And if you are interested, on the website it says that the application deadline is February 1st. But we do still accept applicants through the end of February, or if not, for the next year. That is a 13-month program, and you take 7 courses through the year. Most of it is online, but the first course you come to campus for 3 days. The program continues online until the end when you return to the campus for another 3 days to complete it in face-to-face sessions. Now I'm going to share with you a number of different resources that people often do not know where to find. These are related to signing, and really, all of these resources are great. If I wanted to share all of these resources with you, it would take me all day and night. But this is a good start. Take a look at these. They will lead you to other resources as well. The next few slides will show you what websites such as the Clare Center and VL2 at Gallaudet have in the way of information and publications that will be extremely beneficial to you. This is a wonderful, wonderful app. Children absolutely love it. VL2 has developed one, and there are several more that will be coming out soon, so keep watching for those. I'm not sure if you noticed, but we emphasize bilingualism a great deal, and not just ASL, but reading, writing, ASL, and also speaking. This app includes speech. Here is another listing of wonderful resources for you to take a look at. And I always emphasize that all of the resources that we use with families must be provided with both captions and voice to make it simple and easy for families to enjoy. Now you will see some advocacy strategies listed here. It's interesting, there are many different kinds of advocacy strategies that you see, such as empowering families, collaboration, media and community education, and so on. And this is where we all need to work together. So, can we make a difference for families and deaf children? The answer is yes. Maybe you feel isolated in various locations, but if we come together, we become a powerful ocean for families. Can we make it happen? That completes my presentation. I know you may have some burning questions. You can write them down and send them in, and we will review them and get back to you in just a few minutes. See you soon! Hello, everyone. We are back. We have received a few questions and comments, and due to time constraints, I'm going to choose just a couple of the questions and a comment. Someone said they live in a very rural area and asked, where can I find deaf mentors? Yes, we get that question quite often, and I'm happy that you asked. I would not recommend that you seek out just anyone, like someone you might happen to run into on the street, as a deaf mentor. By comparison, you wouldn't expect just any hearing person to be a teacher of English, would you? You want a person who has gone through some training. So I usually suggest that you start with contacts at the larger schools for the deaf or schools with large mainstream programs serving deaf children, because they will often have deaf mentors there and deaf people employed there. Another suggestion is that you contact the NAD, the National Association of the Deaf. You can contact NAD, and you can also contact your state organizations or state agencies. There are perhaps 12 or 13 deaf mentoring programs across the U.S. now, so you can look online. And some offer training or have materials that you can make use of for deaf mentors as well. Next, a comment. The comment is interesting and says that audiologists are now no longer required to obtain OSHA certification, but they are required to be licensed by their individual states. I actually wasn't aware of that, but I'm happy to know it, and I'm glad to see that change. Before I respond to this comment, I want to say that this is a good example of why deaf community and early intervention specialists and speech and language pathologists and audiologists must collaborate, because we can learn from each other and share information. So thank you to the individual who sent this comment in. My response to the comment is that I'm actually thrilled to hear it. I think that it is easier to make change at a state level than a national level. At the national level or organizational level, the process entails working through a board and gaining member approval. But I think at the state level it can be easier for people in the state to work together to include ASL training for audiology licensure. So thank you for sharing that information with us. Another question came from Alberta, Canada. And the question is it cold out there? And yes, it is cold here too. We are actually expecting 8 to 12 inches of snow tonight. Do you ask because you're interested in moving here? If so, then come on. The next question says, is there any nationwide or statewide movement towards policy change that would require ASL as a form of intervention And secondly, how can we reach group consensus in any joint committee like the JCIH when there are low numbers of deaf representatives in that group? First, let me respond that yes, that's a really good suggestion. And yes, I often think about policies for intervention. And when speaking of JCIH, my dream is to have it documented that any program that funds and provides speech and language pathology as a service must also provide ASL services by default. Perhaps in a consultative model, where an ASL specialist comes alongside the speech pathologist. Some programs have that model in place, and some do not. Typically, you will see it in a residential school for the deaf or in a large bilingual program. I do think that this is something we need to push for, and we could do that at a state level. I can work on it at a national level, but it would be good to push from both ends, from the state level as well as the national level. When it comes to joint consensus and JCIH, the number of deaf representatives is small. In JCIH, there are only 2 of us, Jody Crace from Indiana and myself, as the only deaf members of the committee. However, I'm glad that you asked me about that because we have a strategy that we use, and it can apply to any organization. At JCIH, we have agreed that we will have group consensus. So we don't make decisions by a majority vote. We do so by group consensus, which means there is a lot that goes into the agreement process to reach consensus. That works when there are just a few deaf representatives on a committee, so I'm glad that you asked that question. Okay, I'm seeing more papers coming in with more questions. Thank you, I love your questions. This says, why do we deprive deaf children of visual cues when we don't do that to hearing children? Well, I know. That's exactly why I'm doing this presentation. I don't understand it. And when I try to present to people, sometimes I feel like I'm preaching to the choir, and I really want to get the message out there to the other side. But we are thinking exactly the same way, so help me out. I don't understand. I'm not making things up. I'm using research and experience. But why that is happening just beats me, honestly. Now here's a good question. It says, we understand that all children are individuals. Do I recommend receiving language opportunities for children of all hearing levels, including mild or unilateral, or hearing in one ear? I want to first commend you because it appears you have received my message well. You used the term hearing levels instead of hearing loss, so I'm thrilled. So, JCIH frequently debates this question. And my personal belief is that I think we should provide the child with everything and let the child decide. Follow the child's lead. The child should be our teacher. So I think yes, some children are visual learners and some children are auditory learners. How do we know? We don't know until we try, and then we can move forward from there. You know how an audiogram works. And some mild levels do dip into the speech range at some points. So you just never know. And so you just have to try and go from there. Another one. One more question. All right, this one says, in rural areas, is there any research done on when hearing parents with a newly identified deaf child are mentored, a newly identified family as compared to those of deaf adults. No, there is not research comparing deaf mentored children with deaf children of deaf adults. But my own guess would be that there would not be much difference between deaf mentored children and deaf children of deaf adults. The point is that hearing parents with a deaf child need to see how a deaf person can live independently. How can they get information? How do they form a self-identity and self-concept? The bottom line is that the deaf child needs to know, I am okay. In seeing a mentor who is fine, who is happy, who has hope and can live and has a house, then the deaf child can aspire to be the same. Okay, thank you very much for your questions and your comments today. If you have any further questions, you can submit them by email. I want to thank the Clare Center for inviting me to come and giving this opportunity to talk to you all. We're all in this together, so keep in touch.